Where do we go from here? The year 2020 has prompted us to consider this question time and time again. As a Black woman, a college professor, a daughter, an only child, this particular moment, 2020, means here is the global pandemic, means that there is both violence in our streets and protests to stop that violence. It means that our institutions are being asked to pivot very quickly. And it also means that we have been slowing down to think about who we are as human beings, who we are in connection to our families, who we are in connection to our students and our institutions and our communities, almost simultaneously, but then having the time to think about those things with a kind of intentionality that I don't remember having before.
I think about, that question, like, where is here, right? And so for me, here was this disorienting moment in the middle of a pandemic. Here for me was as a Black woman looking out to see the violence happening in the world, the anti-Blackness, what seemed like blatant racism, and just kind of feeling like that was overtaking everything, not knowing if I would be able to be productive as a scholar, right? Because I was so preoccupied with what was going on in the world. And so here, as you mentioned, is an interesting place to be and an interesting point of departure.
Thinking about where do we go from here as an instructor, as a professor at an HBCU, as a Black woman professor at an HBCU, as the mother of 3 Black boys, as the grandmother of a Black boy, to look out into the world that was changing so rapidly before our eyes, and in many cases, still staying the same. We have to entertain that question of where do we go from here?
This is not just a moment of reflection, but actually an opportunity to collectively transform the things that weren't working for us before and to reimagine something that is very different that will not only work well for us, but our children and our students and the generations that are coming behind.
And so as we have this conversation today, we wanted to situate it within the methodology that informs this broader conversation that we're having. So what we've chosen to use is a method called collective autoethnography. And so in autoethnography, we're looking to interrogate a set of circumstances, to interrogate a question. In this particular context, we're looking at interrogating our current social moment, right? The political moment, this institutional moment. That is our broader objective. And in order to accomplish this broader inquiry, we turn to ourselves, we turn to our experiences, we turn to our bodies and to our positionality as humans, right? To understand what's happening in this broader conversation, in this moment that is informed by a global pandemic, by state-sanctioned violence against Black people, by institutional uncertainty, by overwhelmed students and overworked faculty. How can we turn to how we've experienced this moment? How can we turn to our own perspectives to understand how to shape a broader conversation on transformation and a broader conversation on justice?
We trace this back to about 6 months of interaction, conversation between the 3 of us as Black women scholars, and particularly Black women scholars at HBCUs. Having had a previous relationship, we've traveled globally, we've traveled internationally through the UNCF Mellon International Faculty Seminar for 2 weeks. And in those 2 weeks, we learned not just a great deal as it relates to the African diaspora, the Africana world, but we also had the chance to get to know one another. And so as COVID began to impact the ways in which we all lived, as COVID began to alter our realities, both personally and professionally, it was really important to reach out, to remain connected, to remain in communication with those that are and have been closest to us, and we've developed these relationships, but don't always have the time, or have not always made the time to interact and connect with. We would converse about what was going on with us personally, the impact of COVID on our students and on our institutions. And then we were added to the frustrations of this global pandemic by the all too common and all too prevalent experiences of anti-Black violence. And in many cases, it seems like police sanctioned violence against Black bodies. And it was with that backdrop that some very robust conversations were had.
I think about kind of the things that drew me to this conversation, because on one hand, it's this scholarly exploration, right? It's something that we approach as professors, as scholars at historically Black institutions, as Black women, but it's also a question that's deeply rooted in our humanity. So it was a conversation that gave me impulse. It was a conversation that gave me some impetus, right, for moving forward. And I think part of that collective nature of our conversation really struck me, because I wasn't having to try to figure things out on my own and come up with things, but I had two people beside me who were asking the same questions. And any time that I was starting to feel discouraged or start to think like maybe I should give up, right, I had two people beside me who were telling me to keep going. And that was part of the amazing value that I saw in our collective inquiry.
I often tell my students something that someone told me years ago. Like, if you're the smartest person in your group, then you need a new group. And so for me, the idea of accountability, it was helpful not only in the meetings that we had, but it was just the daily encouragement. That is so just helpful to be in a space where people are moving forward, but at the same time, they are not going to let you falter. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that there were some times that there wasn't the push for productivity, but it was just more of a like, okay, if we need to stand with you in this moment, we're standing. If you're ready to walk, let's walk. And I think that for me as a scholar who is now in a new area, I probably never said this to Charmayne, but sometimes when we are taking a look at some type of phenomena, I'm like, okay, you gotta like try to think like the historians think. Like, what would Charmayne say in this situation? And those were the things that prevented me from not only not standing still, but I think that the exchange allowed me to just incorporate a variety of perspectives that I wouldn't have been able to do all by myself.
You know, we entered this time where the norm was disrupted, and it was, you know, to exist in this space with all of this uncertainty. It did prove to be in some cases paralyzing, not just from a productivity standpoint, but mentally and emotionally to have to contend with that. And so to have this space for us to interact, to talk about the work that we were needing to do, and then to saying as a collective, okay, well, how can we help to make sure that you do that work? Right? Because you can do it. That's really something that's transformative when we're talking about our own personal experience. And when we feel empowered and we feel encouraged for ourselves as individuals, that helps and it translates. We see it reflected in the work that we can do, both as researchers and scholars, but also as instructors.
Yeah.
And so that really, that sense of community, of the
Yeah.
connection, of the
Yeah.
encouragement, it wasn't just about one area of our lives or one area of our existence. It became holistic. I was like, okay, well, I have to teach my classes. I have to prepare for my students. I owe that to them. But there's no way that I could do this, what I needed to do for me personally. But in this space, again, just sort of drawing on that community and engaging these kinds of questions, and
Yeah.
having a group that you know, held me accountable for what I did and encouraged me when I felt like I couldn't. That was really important for helping to ensure that the work got done on all levels.
You know, we started this conversation by kind of defining our here, right? And we're like, where do we go from here? What does here mean, right? Where was our starting point? And as you were both talking about this collective, right? And this idea that you're walking with people, you're walking beside people, right? They're not letting you falter or fall behind, right? They're giving you, you're getting accountability. And then I thought, like, oh, you know, we're also having a conversation, not about just the here or there, but we're having a conversation about the we, right? How do we define the we in the where do we go from here? And to Charmayne's point, you know, it's informing how we operate as instructors. And so we become a we with our students. Where do we as instructors and students go as we face this unprecedented pivot? It informs our relationships with our institutions, right? Where does the HBCU go hand in hand with its faculty, right? And then that's that idea of we're moving together, right? We're not letting each other fall behind. And that's part of the reason why we want to have this conversation about, okay, what is the current state of the mid-pandemic HBCU? Because we are in this together. The students, the faculty and staff, the administrators, the institution itself. How are we enforcing those connections? And because I relate to your experience, I see myself in your experience. I see you and I in the same place, right? And I see us moving together. You're not going to fall behind. I mean, that's what we're telling our students. Listen, I'm not abandoning you. I'm moving with you. We're moving forward. So, you know, everyone grab a hand, like we're moving forward, right? And that's also the conversation we want to have with our institutions, where we want it to be something where they're telling us that we're moving forward together, and we're echoing, yes, we're moving forward together. And it's this idea of the shared connectivity and our similar situation and how the we moves forward.
Sometimes we can operate in a silo, just talking to the people who are in our department or the people who are at our institution. And so I think it's very helpful for me to be in South Carolina teaching, for Charmayne to be in Georgia, for Eva to be in Alabama. And so this kind of check-in, okay, so my institution is doing this, and, you know, and what is your institution doing? And I found myself sometimes, you know, tweeting on Twitter, and posting things on social media. Some of that like reimagining.
Yeah.
Some of it is slogan form, you know, social distancing is social justice. And some of it was just this idea of, wouldn't it be really opportune for HBCUs to develop a plan that might bring us all together? And certainly no one would believe that one size would fit all or one plan would fit all. But it's very interesting because Du Bois, in his essays around education for Black people, he's talking about, this is what the private HBCU might be doing. This is what the public HBCU might be doing. And if Du Bois can do that in the 1940s and 50s, to be sure, we could be thinking in the 21st century, what might be a set of best practices so that we can move together and pull resources and ideas and collaborate across HBCUs so that we are practicing things like mental health days that we
Yes.
could just have just at HBCUs. Like this is a HBCU mental health day across the board.
Yeah.
That we are developing some rituals around loss. I think that oftentimes our students come to us and they have such varied backgrounds, and there are moments when we know not to assume that everybody's coming with the same exposure to culture or knowledge base. And certainly COVID-19 is no different. And as young people are losing people, we're losing people at a rate that almost feels like it won't allow us to go back and properly mourn. And so I think that surely HBCUs are a place where we could practice and share some of these rituals around what does it mean to remember the people that we've lost, the people who that we may have lost in the communities surrounding our campuses.
Yeah.
So it doesn't just have to be about what happens in the confines or the walls of our institutions, but we're also a part of a larger community in those cities and towns where our schools are located. And so just thinking outside of the walls of my school and where we're located, and thinking across our various states. And it definitely forced me to think about ways in which we might do some things with intentionality, because I think that our response to loss and our disproportionate vulnerability is something that our students are looking to us.
Yeah.
And if we don't make any gestures, or if we try to treat things as business as usual, then they will do the same. And then it's a moment where we will miss teaching that empathy.
Yeah.
And we don't want to have that happen. But I think that being in conversation with both of you helped me to just kind of flesh through some of that. Like, what can we do on a much larger scale that has very little to do with what predominantly white institutions are doing, or whatever is supposed to be, just kind of like in the public sphere. How do we address our families, our communities, and then our quest for healing around some of these things that are going on for us for the short term, and hopefully even some things that are on a much larger scale.
You mentioned the ideas of both community and empathy. And I think that it's really that those are very important for us to focus our attention on. In the same way that you mentioned the intentionality, right? That we have to be very intentional about the things that we do. And I would say that that's even more important and necessary. I don't even just think it's important. I believe that it's necessary when we're having that conversation about HBCUs, because these are spaces that were created with a particular mission. And that mission was not just about educating students. It was about creating and helping to facilitate a sense of community. How do you, and I think that for us, we're looking at that community, and there are multiple levels. So we can look at how we're helping to facilitate connection and to create systems of support, systems of recognition and acknowledgement between the institutions that we serve, and the communities in which they're located,
Yeah.
but also across campuses. That's one of the things that's so beneficial for us, is that we're having these conversations about what our institutions are doing, and in some cases what we felt like our institutions should be doing, sort of crafting that vision about where we move forward. And it's not something that should happen in a silo. It's not something that should happen or we should experience in isolation, right? Because HBCUs, you know, when they come into existence in the 19th century, they are serving a larger objective. Their aim is higher than just about education. It's about empowerment. It's about uplift. It's about how do we make these communities self-sustaining? How do we help these communities to be self-determining? And if that's the mission under which these institutions were founded, you know, 150 years ago, I think that in the 21st century, with all that we're facing, with all that we're experiencing, if we're not engaging in those kinds of conversations about accountability, if we're not talking about sort of how are we very intentional in the work that we're setting out to do, we're really missing an opportunity. We're missing an opportunity to live according to the missions and visions under which these institutions were established in the first place, and to serve the populations that they were intended to serve in the first place. And I don't just mean the students.
There's the obvious consideration at the institutional level of like stopping the hemorrhaging, right? So we're stopping like all of these emergencies, putting out these fires that have emerged as a result of the pandemic and of the financial and economic realities that it has necessitated. But at the same time, you know, that we're aware of those realities, could we shape a perspective that is not purely defined, right, by the negative parts of the pandemic? And so I remember in our conversation, what Catherine actually said was, the beauty of this is that we are the ones who make the rules. And it was in the context of our daily writing goals, right? And so we said, okay, I'm going to try to do 100 words a day, 1,000 words a day, 1,000 words a day.
1,000.
And so we said, okay, I'm going to try to do 1,000 words a day. And so Catherine was just telling us the different ways that she got to 1,000 words, right? So it might be a poem. It might be an open letter to HBCU presidents about the precautions they need to take to ensure the safety of their students and their staff, right? It might be a chapter that is due under a deadline, right? Or it might be any other number of things. And I remember it just kind of, at the time, opened up my mind, because I was thinking, oh, 1,000 words a day, you know, it's going to have to be that academic article, right? It's going to have to be academic writing. And I remember actually saying, like, I didn't know creative writing could count. I didn't know we could, like, a poem could count, right? And so, and then just that prompting, right, to take away the restrictions that I had unknowingly placed on myself, and to understand that there was this element of agency, right? We are the ones that make the rules in this moment. And so as HBCUs are approaching these questions about how are we going to move forward, what is our curriculum going to look like? What is our institutional structure going to look like? How are students going to have an HBCU experience in this social distancing, virtual learning age? On one hand, it's a monumental task, right? Like, it requires us to radically reimagine higher education, right? The ways that we engage, the ways that we form community. But at the same time, there is this beauty in the fact that in some ways the pandemic shaking us up has freed us from perhaps practices that we were tied to through tradition, right? Things that just would have been too hard to unsettle because they were so deeply ingrained in our institutions. And part of what this moment does is give us the opportunity to dream again, right? To re-envision, right, how we're going to approach these things that are still our core and fundamental purpose, right? We don't change who we are, but we may look at ways to adapt the way that we do what we do and the ways that we serve the people and the communities that we serve. So I especially when it comes to the conversation that emerges with our colleagues here at the end of this this presentation, I really want people to think in that vein, right? The beauty that comes out of this, if there is a silver lining that comes out of this very off-putting, destabilizing situation, the beauty is it gives us a chance to make new rules. And if we are dreaming and we are coming up with a vision that isn't tied necessarily to how we've done things in the past, right? But rather to the purpose for which we were doing things and the people that motivate us to do things, then what would those rules look like? Right, as we move forward as HBCUs, what do the rules, our rules, what does our vision for the curriculum look like? What does our vision for institutional governance look like? What does our vision for faculty creativity and scholarly production and collaboration outside of silos look like? Because if there is any beauty in this moment, if there is a silver lining in this moment, it's that it's given us the chance to reimagine, right? And to dream a new dream and to set a new vision for what HBCUs will be in the 21st century and beyond.
One thing that I was thinking too is that I have really tried to take advantage of the slowdown to do some things differently.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been going to virtual meetings around texting banks for the election, and I was encouraging my students that if they felt comfortable to get training as poll workers. But then I also discovered that if you became a poll watcher, that was primarily a task that was outside and that I could show up and wear my mask and just call a number if somebody was being placed in a situation where they felt intimidated. And so as I have been trying to tell them that an election is just one tactic among many,
right?
That I always tell my students that I would not ask you to do anything that I would not do myself. And so that goes to writing and to research. And even this particular season, it has been around activism. And so I know I had some really traditional notions of what that looked like, but I wanted to step into their world of where they are texting a lot. And so, you know, interestingly enough, I got assigned Alabama and I sent hundreds of text messages until people said stop, like stop sending me messages. But I can see all of these ways in which I'm not just asking them to walk in my shoes, I'm walking in their shoes. And that is also spilling over into classes. That I've been talking with students who are really struggling in lots of different ways. I have 3 or 4 siblings that are trying to do school at home at the same 10 o'clock hour as your class. And I can see those students like spooling. They're coming in, but they don't quite make it into the Zoom classroom. And all of the ways in which we try to get their voices, their contributions, their work into class. And there are some ways in which, just as a teacher, I'm thinking to myself, okay, what do I need them to learn from this class? Maybe we don't need to do that 3 times.
Right.
So maybe we do it twice. And the first time I am, describing something. And then the second time I'm actually providing less instruction.
Yeah.
And I see them or I hear them saying, okay, so you didn't write how many slides you wanted us to have, or can you give us a little bit more information? And now I'm saying to them, actually, we've done several projects and I'm trusting you.
Yeah.
I'm trusting you to do something where you're going to learn a little bit more about what we're studying, and you have the tools. And so show me what you have.
Yeah.
And that is me taking all that I am experiencing, right? And walking in their shoes and saying to them, you can do this. And this is the place for you to practice. And, oh, somebody missed an assignment this week. I'm just having students who got A's on various projects.
Yeah.
I'm like, showcase your work.
Yeah.
And the student that may have missed that one assignment, this is how a really well put together project looks. You can ask your classmate questions. Did you have trouble finding sources for that? How difficult was it? How easy? What was the best thing about doing that project? And then you go ahead and knock it out and get it done. Yeah. And just knowing that I trust myself even more to be able to look at the assignments that I'm posting and to say that this student, I can say with confidence, based on what they've turned in, that they have grasped this set of skills that I needed them to grasp, as opposed to not intentionally, but maybe a little mechanically, oh, we've got to read this book. Yeah. And this book and this book. And we've got to get all of this in. And it's like, okay, but this is an intro class. Yeah. Yeah. And if I can whet their appetite, if they can demonstrate some skills, get a little bit of content knowledge under their belt, and I can whet their appetite to come back and take more classes, then that's a win. Yeah. And in a global pandemic. I always say to my students, like, okay, so you're behind with this one project. So you tell me what I need to do to make sure you're successful in it. And then we're going to take a few minutes just to celebrate that you got it all done in a global pandemic. And I think that I try to also be a little transparent in those moments where I may be struggling around something. Yeah. And so I say, okay, well, look, I have this deadline on Friday. You have a deadline on Friday. So let's check in with each other to make sure that it's done, because this work requires me to do some of the same things that I'm asking you to do. Yeah. And so I think that not just trying to teach empathy, but to model empathy, and then to open myself up for the capacity to grow in empathetic ways that I think really allow me to bring the best of who I am to my students. And I think that they appreciate that.
I hear you mention empathy, and I think I would say empathy and grace. And empathy and grace, not just for our students, but for ourselves and for our colleagues. Because I'm thinking here about this collaboration that we have created, the conversations that we have as a collective. But how do we expand that, sort of beyond this? So how do I take that back to Clark Atlanta? And how do you take that to Oakwood, Eva? And how do you take that to Claflin? And the ways in which that can transform not just the experiences of the students, but how do we
transform the experiences of our faculty, of our colleagues,
Yeah.
because we definitely know and understand that our students are suffering in sometimes ways that we can't understand. We can certainly sympathize, but we might not be even able to empathize with that because of, you know, our positions and how our positionality is different. But you think about the same kinds of challenges that your colleagues might be in.
Right.
And for me in particular, as someone who has familiarity with online instruction and the ways in which the initial transition in March at the beginning of the global pandemic were bothersome, but not terribly, and inconvenient,
Right.
but not terribly problematic for myself.
Right.
And then for us, because in my particular institution, we made the determination to move to completely online in the fall semester. And so what does that mean for individuals who don't have that same level of comfort, who have a great deal of anxiety, who may feel like I am very well versed in my subject matter, but how do I deliver that in a virtual environment? How do I do that online and feel like I'm doing it well? Or just individuals who are overwhelmed at the prospect completely, you know, just I don't want to be on campus, but I also am not really feeling very comfortable with the alternative.
Right.
And I think that because we're examining this whole idea of we get to make the rules, that one of those rules is that we have to give and extend some grace in this space to all parties. So whether that's the grace for our students and we wanting to be empathetic to them and sort of modeling that empathetic behavior, I think that we also need to model that empathy for our colleagues and model that empathy for ourselves.
Yeah.
Because there is so much to deal with. There is so much to contend with and to try to make sense of in this time period. I mean, throughout all of 2020, but even as, you know, we find ourselves here in this first week of November, there's even more things for us to have to try to make sense of and contend with. And so I think it's really important, it's really necessary that we are as kind to one another and kind to ourselves as we can possibly be. You know, we have the song says, "We all we got." We are all we've got. Whether it's as an individual, as a community, we all we got. And so we have to do whatever we can in whatever ways we can to support, to uplift, to empower one another so that we can see lasting transformations that can help us to move and thrive into the 21st century and beyond.
Where do we go from here?